Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. We're very pleased to welcome today Christopher Connelly. Chris is a lead sports scientist at the North Carolina State University, and Chris is going to talk about sports analytics, leveraging raw GPS data for optimizing soccer players' performance. We would really request you to actually stay in the webinar at the end to actually give a short survey on your feedback. Thank you very much. Please welcome Chris.
All right, how's it going, guys? So today I'm going to be giving you kind of a view into how we're trying to use the data we're collecting with the athletic department at NC State University. So my role there is kind of the head of our kind of sports science initiative. I kind of came in from a background of more biomechanics and kind of exercise physiology. But as kind of this side of sports started to develop, I kind of fell into working with a few groups in the soccer setting. I had worked with the North Carolina Courage, which is a professional women's soccer team, and then eventually found my way over to NC State, and then just kind of continued to develop down this path and work more and more on the side of trying to not only find better ways to collect data with our athletes, but then find better ways to be able to try and use that data to help gain information we didn't have before and ultimately improve our ability to try and enhance our process for how we train our athletes. So with the goal in mind that we're trying to build a system for athlete management with our data. So we're trying to create a system that can bring all of our different data sources together so that we can be able to have one kind of cohesive analysis of the data, create a picture between all of our different data sources that is trying to tell a complete story rather than different stories from each source. And then eventually trying to use our data to then give us an indication of what may happen in the future. So other than these main things here with our athletes having the data coming in from the assessments that we have, reporting that data back to coaches and having the way for us to get our data from our original data sources, ending off with eventually trying to apply any sort of advanced analytic techniques that we deem necessary to try and gain whatever information we're after. But ultimately, it will come down to kind of the needs of the coaches for each specific sport. So for the purpose of this, we're talking about our soccer teams, or the data that we'll focus on here is more men's soccer, but what do the coaches need to help themselves, and what can we help them with to help them train the athletes better, or better understand what the training does to the athlete, the stresses that are applied to the athlete over time through exposure to their sport and everything else that they go through on a daily basis as a student athlete. So what is our GPS data actually telling us? When we collect it on the field, what are we getting from it? What information can we get from that, and what can we decipher to try and do anything or influence anything moving forward? And then how can that eventually help us, have a better understanding of how we can optimally train our athletes and understand what stresses they go under on a daily basis, so that we know what may need to be adjusted going forward to make sure we're not over or under training these athletes. So the different data sources that we have coming in fall into kind of three different categories that we would split them up. Readiness data being pieces of data that are giving us an idea of more of a frequently collected basis, let us know kind of how much fatigue they may be under for the moment, and look at more kind of trends over time. Where are they at compared to their normal baseline, and how has that been changing recently, or what may it look like going forward if we stay on the same path. Training load data being anything that's measuring actual physical work that they're doing out on the field or in the gym. And then performance data being stuff that we try and link to their ability to perform their sport. So in our case, it's hard to really directly measure that with a team sport, because There's a lot of different factors that will play into how they actually perform their sport that we can't really control for or get an understanding of. So a lot of this comes down to more physical characteristics that we can measure on the field or in the gym that would be related to them performing their sport. So whether it's sprinting or jumping or strength measures, stuff like that, giving us an idea of what they'll be able to do. If we can improve these capacities, they should have a better possibility of performing better in their sport. And the data in red is the data that we'll be focusing a little bit more on today. The two different questionnaires, readiness being the thing they fill out first thing in the morning, giving us an idea of how they feel from the previous day, how they slept the night before, how sore they may be, different questions to give us an idea of how ready they may be for training or the game that day. Training load questionnaire being after a session, whether it's on the field or in the gym, how hard they rate that session, how hard they felt it was, how draining they felt it was, kind of giving us an idea of how hard it was for their upper body, lower body, breathlessness, kind of giving us different dimensions of difficulty that they were perceiving during the session, and then actually looking into our GPS data. So all the different variables we'll be collecting from our practice during each day of training or even during the games. And then just a quick view of different pieces of equipment that we use. The gym aware in the middle will track velocity of a movement in the gym. So we use that kind of as readiness data and also performance data, because we can use it to track how they're comparing to their normal, but also if they're getting better when we do our occasional testing. And then with the thing in the bottom left, that is called a NORD board. So that's more specific to hamstring work. So this is something that will measure a Nordic hamstring curl. So we're getting hamstring specific strength, and we're splitting it between each leg so we can view how much force is being produced by each leg separately, and we can see how they compare to normal, and also if they're able to put out more force over time, then they're probably getting stronger and we're doing something right. And then in the other bottom corner, we have our force plates. So that's what we'll measure jumps with. So we can get force output for those jumps, how quickly they're kind of going through their motions and how high they're jumping based on time they're spending in the air. All different things that we can use to collect readiness data or performance data. And then we have our GPS devices, which are provided through StatSports. They're kind of one of the main drivers now, and they have a partnership with US Soccer. So we ended up striking a deal with them to be able to outfit our soccer team. And that's how we can collect it each day. They wear that bib that holds the device in the back, and it'll just get speeds, distances. It'll connect to their heart rate monitor to kind of help us collect all that data during each session. In the top corner, you can see kind of a little beacon device there. That is what we use during the session to be able to track the devices live. We don't necessarily use too much of the data live ourselves, but you can see kind of a view that we can track that stuff live with an iPad while we're out there. But usually the main thing that I'd be using it for live would just to be make sure the devices are on, working correctly, collecting all of our data so that when I get back into the gym later to process it all, that we're not going to have a device that wasn't on or someone that wasn't collecting data correctly, and then we lost out on that information. So then they have their own software that we kind of download the data to, so that we can make sure that we layer on all of our different time periods for our drills. And then that's another piece that we do kind of with the live session ability, is we can set our timestamps for each drill that happens during that practice, so that we can make sure we can layer that on when we come back. It makes our lives a little bit easier with the processing, so that it's all done there on the data, so that we can then send this data from here to where we actually want it to be. So with the idea of having an athlete management system where we're trying to bring all these different data sources together, our big thing here is we're using HPCC Systems through LexisNexis. They give us the tools kind of to be able to build the system that we want to have in place so that we can eventually, reach all the goals of how we're going to have our data together, how we want to analyze it, and eventually use that to inform coaches on what's happening. So the main goals here were to try and form a process to try and pull all of our different data from the different sources to a place where we can then take that data and upload it to HPCC Systems. Once we get it into their system, then we can distribute it across our server so that we can then start to process it and get it into kind of the data forms that we need it to be in so that we can start actually working with the data, start to create all of our process for how we're going to clean the data, process the data, make sense of all of it, make sure it's stored correctly, and then be able to start doing any manipulations or aggregations or whatever we need to do to find the information that we're after. And then once we can do all of that, we then spray the data back out of the server so that we can send it to wherever it needs to go to be visualized. One thing we're working on now is kind of a new way to try and visualize it. We want to try and build kind of a custom UI within HPCC Systems or within our server connected to it so that we can then have a little bit more of an intuitive process compared to what we were doing before. But there's some examples of what we were doing before in here because we're not quite at the point of having that kind of redone quite yet. But here's just kind of a quick view of all the different data files that will come in from our soccer teams. This is men and women. You can see all the files on the left, and then just kind of a focused view of just the men's data, and then the stuff that is circled in red is kind of what we're focusing on today. So we have all of our different files from all of our different sources, but today we're really just looking at the GPS data, which is really the summary view of the data that we get from StatSports. We have our raw GPS data coming straight from there, kind of without any context really, just every data point from there's 10 data points per second. So we get 10 data points for distance, speed, heart rate, all of that per second. So we get the raw form, and then we're going to add context to it with the more summary data. And then at the bottom, we have our athlete info files that will give us all the information we need for our athletes, what team they play on, what year they're in currently in school, male or female, position they play for their sport, all that type of stuff to make sure that we can have all of those different categorical things that we may need later. So then just a quick view of how we kind of set up to try and make sense of all of our data. First, we need to make sure everything is being stored the right way and we know what data is what. So we have to tell the system again, what each piece of data that's in these files is, how we want it to be stored, what type of data it is, so that when we go to actually manipulate everything, everything will go as intended. And then from here, we can start to have our different data files and start to figure out how we want to process this. So if we have on top our raw GPS data, and we have on the bottom our summary GPS data, we can use that summary GPS data to start layering on the information we have there to the raw stuff. So the raw stuff, we have no idea what's happening during the practice, when certain things are happening, who that may be. So then we can take our summary data and start to say, all right, well, during this part of this practice, this is when this drill is happening. This is how long that drill went for. This is when the next drill happens. So we can start to pick through our raw GPS data and figure out where the important time points are happening, what periods we want to look at, or what periods we want to bunch together so that we can start to find any of the stuff that we're looking for. And then on the right side, we have our game day information. So this is one way in soccer teams will typically try and organize their days where they relate everything to when the next game is or where the previous game was. So for instance, GD is always game day, GD +1 or GD -1 means that there's one day since a game or one day before a game. So by kind of adding this context to each day, we can understand where each game is in relation to this day, and then bunch together some of the days that will have similar categories, because a lot of times if it's 2 days before a game or 3 days before a game, we'll have similar type practices, so that later on we can understand, all right, well, if we do this on a game day -2, how did that compare to another game day -2 where the practices should have been pretty similar? So one thing that we do from there to try and make sense of some of this data is apply our summary GPS data to the raw GPS data and try and find some average speeds and distances for specific drill periods. So now we want to start to understand, all right, well, during this practice, what happened during each of these drills? And if we want to look back later on when they typically perform this specific drill, what normally happens, what can we expect this drill to be like, so that when they do it, we know typically, all right, if they're doing, a game, obviously it's going to be high intensity, it's going to be longer duration. If they're doing a short-sighted game during a practice, it's going to be a smaller dimension field. There typically won't be as many people on at the same time. It will be a lot more short sprints and little breaks in between, rather than something that's going to be more continuous, where, if they're playing in bigger field dimensions, there's going to be more continuous running, more people on the field at a given time, more distance to cover. So we can start to understand what are going to be some of the constraints or some of the typical outcomes from certain drills, so that we know what to expect, and then we know whether that drill is kind of, if we see after a certain practice, all right, this drill doesn't really make sense compared to what they normally do when they perform this drill, then let's figure out why that happened. Why was it different than normal? And then another way we can start to look at some of these things, again, kind of a measure of intensity, or giving us an idea of difference between certain types of drills. Here we're kind of bunching together time periods and getting average heart rates for those time periods. So here we're kind of going through and trying to find windows of 1 minute, 3 minutes, and 5 minutes, and then trying to get kind of the peak averages of heart rate during those windows. So for each drill, what was kind of the highest minute of heart rate achieved by this athlete? And then during that same drill, what was the highest for 3 minutes? What was the highest for 5 minutes? Obviously, some drills won't go for that long. So depending on the drill, kind of depends on what of these measures is going to have a bigger impact. But that kind of, again, gives us the context to say, all right, well, if we're looking at more kind of short, quick effort type drills, we would expect to have higher 1 minute averages. If they're more continuous drills or bigger field dimension drills, then we'll expect to have higher 5 minute averages. And we can help the coaches now understand what some of these drills will typically entail, or what kind of we'll get out of these drills on a normal basis, so that if they plan a practice with these drills, we can then say, all right, well, expect to have this type of outcome, expect the work to be like this for the athletes, so that we know what to expect. And then at the end of the practice, if what was actually achieved was what was intended, then that's good. If it wasn't, let's figure out why and what we may need to do, kind of adjusting going forward to make sure that next time kind of the intent of the drills is met. And then one more thing here is kind of another kind of specific demand that the coaches came to us with. They wanted to be able to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the game data and better understand different parts of the game and how they compare, and how we can kind of look at different games over time and see what's happening during each part of the game. Because obviously we can look back and say, all right, well, they covered X amount of distance during this game, we won or we lost. But they wanted to take a deeper look and see, during first half of the game or second half of the game, how much are we doing during each part of the first half and second half. Can we kind of dig down and start to separate all that stuff apart? So we created a way to look at each 15-minute period in a game. So typically a half in soccer is 45 minutes long. They'll have some stoppage time, so sometimes it goes a little bit over that. So sometimes we'll have 4 periods here, But typically each half will have 3 periods with a fourth kind of just being spillover extra time. But each other bucket here, as you can see, is kind of a 15-minute period. So first half and second half will be split into 3 to 4 different time periods, and we'll be able to get the average speeds and distances for each of these periods of time, so that we can then be able to see, all right, during the first half, was their distances kind of tailing off? Were they covering more distance in the first 15 minutes compared to the last 15 minutes? In the second half, if they were covering the same amount of average distance for just kind of the half in general, does the distribution of distance between the different pockets of time look the same towards the first half, or are they kind of trailing off through the game? Are they kind of covering a lot more distance at the very end, and maybe they were a little too conservative early on? Just another way to try and break it down and look at the information a little bit differently to try and gain any other information that we can. And then looking back on just kind of a normal practice, there's many different types of drills that can happen, many different things that can be happening on the field at a given time, many different formations they could be in, or different roles a player may be playing, different constraints with the size of the field or the nature of what type of drill they're doing. So how can we take a step back and make sense of all this when there's so much going on the field at the same time, and sometimes different groups will be doing different things on the field at the same time. So you can't possibly be watching everybody all the time and understand what's actually happening. So part of our job is to help make sense of all this for the coaches, so we can understand, all right, during each drill, what's actually happening, what are these players doing? And then just as a quick example here, we can see during this practice, there's 2 drills going on at the same time on opposite ends of the field. One group is doing one thing, one group is doing something completely different demands for each of these 2 groups. So how can we then kind of retroactively go back and say, all right, well, these 2 things were happening at the same time, but what was each group doing? How does it differ? What can we expect each of these 2 groups to be going through during that time? So when we look back at kind of our numbers at the end of the practice, there's going to be differences in what happened there, so we should be able to know kind of why those differences were happening and not expect to see, all right, well, these guys were lower in distance, so they did less work. Well, it might just be that for a certain period of time they were doing a drill that was a little bit less intensive, so that's why something may be a little lower or higher for a different group, which doesn't necessarily mean that the entire practice they did less work. So this is just a quick view again from what I was saying before with how we try and visualize our data. So we were bringing our data into a place to try and create these visuals to make sense of the data for coaches. So here again, we're looking at this game data split into each section of the game. Right now, it's not the different buckets, but it is first half, second half, and any overtimes there may be. And this is a view of each game through the season. So we can see each game that happened, each different section of that game. We can see, what games they may have covered more in the first half or the second half, what games may have been pretty similar, and what the differences are with some of the games where they went to overtime. And then again here, this is looking at the buckets. So now we can look at specific buckets for each player during this one particular game. So this is looking at our October 11th game. We can see each player's distance for each bucket of the second half. So first 15, second 15, third 15, and then some spillover time, what each player was doing for each of those sections of time during the second half. So we can start to kind of dig down and understand a little bit more what was happening during that period of time and hit any possible questions that the coaches may have. And then here, just another quick view of a specific athlete versus the team for a specific game. So we're looking at first half and second half here, looking at the different buckets again of 15-minute periods, with the fourth period being that extra time, and then how this athlete compares to what the rest of the team is doing. So on top, we have our athlete, on the bottom, we have our team. So we can take a quick look and say, all right, well, this specific athlete seems to be doing a little bit above the team average for each section here. And then definitely during the second 15 minutes of the second half, they had a nice difference between how much distance they were covering versus the rest of the team. So after we've done some of this kind of digging in and analyzing our data, what can we do to now hit the other end of what we were trying to say before, where we want to try and take this data and try and understand what we may expect going forward. So two things that we have developed more recently was ways that we can try and understand how our subjective data is affected by our objective data. So looking at our subjective questionnaires and see how, if we can look at our GPS variables and understand what's happening on a given day, how can we start to understand the relationship with how that then affects their subjective responses the next day. So there's some machine learning libraries built into HPCC Systems that allow us to start working on some of this kind of stuff. So we built a learning tree model to try and predict some of our subjective outcomes based on our external load variables from the GPS. And then another thing that we had worked on was called a DB scan. So this is a density-based spatial clustering of applications with noise. So more of kind of an unsupervised learning view to just try and throw our different data in and see how it kind of then organizes the different data based on how it may be similarly related. So first, kind of looking into how we built the learning tree model, we kind of took different variables from our GPS, just kind of separating by athlete and looking at their impacts during a session. So this is just kind of how many kind of jostling or kind of context they may have with another player, or if they go to the ground, or if they have a lot of quick, hard movements, those will register as impacts. Normally, they'll tend to have a lot more of kind of a physical toll over the course of a practice or over a course of a few weeks or a game. So we've seen a lot of connection there with the higher the impacts, usually it leads to them having higher player loads in a practice and then more of kind of an effect from that practice in terms of how they can recover from it. And then looking at a metric like distance or distance per minute during a practice, we didn't have kind of a huge difference between how the model ran with distance versus distance per minute, but either of those tended to be pretty good at being kind of our next level of importance for a variable, where distance is kind of just your overall volume view of that practice, and then distance per minute is a little bit more of a view on kind of the intensity of it. And then time above 85% of their max heart rate, again, we'll say, how much of this time is being spent at a high amount of their heart rate, doing a high level of work. Another view of kind of how intense a practice or drill may be, and how that may affect their recovery therefore after. And then we have our readiness score based on their questionnaires. So for the men's side, they'll fill out their questionnaires on an app called Fit for 90. It's kind of been designed for soccer, and it is a platform that allows them to kind of have their questionnaires, that kind of outcome stuff, along with their training prescription in one place. So we'll pull their data from there. It'll give us kind of a score based on all of their different reported pieces for their readiness questionnaire. And then we can try and predict that based on their variables that we're collecting from the GPS. So far, hasn't been super accurate, but I also think that for something like a team sport like this, it's hard to understand all of the different things that actually play into it and what variables we can't actually account for. Because again, in a team sport, we'll have stuff that are environmental variables or things like, the strategy of the other team or injuries that may happen in a game that will affect the way the game plays out, that will affect how athletes are actually performing in that game or how a practice might go, which may lead to kind of the outcome that we're trying to measure. So a lot of times there's things we can't account for that may lead to a certain outcome. So there's always going to be stuff that will lead to uncertainties that we can't predict for, or things that will just cause kind of extra noise in the data. So definitely not trying to have a system that's perfect here, but trying to find our best possible way to understand this data the best we can and see what kind of relationships we're finding here. And then going on to the cluster analysis here, what we did was we ran through all the different types of drills that we have in our library that we collected and how those drills may be connected to each other. So far, the main thing that we had been looking for was the just different GPS variables through a practice and how they may be related, because obviously if we're doing our learning tree stuff, we don't want to have too many variables that are going to be kind of have a high level of collinearity and start to not be great to have together, because it may just be adding more noise to the data. So we want to then not only understand kind of what the relationship is between our different GPS variables, but then again, what's the difference between our different drills, how they may compare based on all these variables, and how we can start to understand if a coach comes to us and wants to design a practice around certain type of drills, or they have some physical demands they have in mind where they want to have a practice focus on a little bit more time spent on high intensity distance, less total distance covered, but they want a lot of high intensity sprint type efforts without accumulating a lot of distance over the course of a practice, and we can help them decide what drills might accomplish that goal based on kind of what understanding we can gain on our drills based on trying to do some of these different analyses. But based on what we had done so far, there seems to be 4 main clusters, a nice amount of outliers, but again, we haven't been able to have a full kind of visualization of what this actually looks like when they're thrown together yet. So we're still working on this to kind of gain a full understanding of how we can actually use this going forward. And again, a lot of this stuff is all still kind of stuff that we're working on improving and trying to understand better to kind of eventually get to what our end goal is. So we want to continue to try and rework how we're using our learning tree model to understand our connection between our subjective and objective data. We may need to start bringing in some other things, such as kind of their subjective training load stuff. So how their objective training load compares to their subjective training load, and how that may also influence their subjective readiness. So if they cover X amount of distance measured by the GPS, but then they also perceive that session to be, X out of 10 on a scale of perceived effort, does that change kind of the connection of our data based on their readiness score from the next day? And then also trying to use our cluster analysis again to better understand how we can help coaches plan for our practice going forward, or better understand different drills that we're doing and how that may affect how a practice is accomplished, or how that may kind of be in line with what the coaches are trying to achieve in a particular training session or during a particular game with their strategy that they want to implement. And then again, try and, if we can, then now say, all right, if we are trying to plan certain game days to go a certain way. So if we have a game at the end of the week and we have our, game day -4, -3, -2, those sessions again will probably be similar to what they normally would be compared to another game day -4, -3. So if we know what we want to accomplish in that type of practice, and we understand what demands we may face with certain drills, we can start to then say, all right, we have these days coming up. Here's some kind of different combinations of drills we may want to use on these particular days to try and make sure that these days kind of go in line with how we want them to go, so that we can have these athletes be best prepared for the game that's coming up. So kind of just trying to throw that all back together to understand kind of what the main goal is again, just try and have as complete of a view of possible of, everything that the athlete goes through on a daily basis as a student athlete, and how that affects their ability to actually perform in their sport, so that we can understand, what we may be able to do to try and influence that process and try and gain information from the data to help us do a better job at training these athletes or understanding the stresses on these athletes so that we can then help better prepare them for when they need to be at their best, and then also help the coaches understand, when we train these athletes a certain way or we execute a practice or a game, what effect that has on the athlete. Are these things actually going the way we want them to go? And if so, or if they aren't, then how can we adjust going forward to make sure that everything is a little more in line with what we want? Because again, we're both on the same page of trying to make sure these athletes are always ready to go or are always at their best, to make sure that when they need to perform in these games, that they are going to be able to perform to the best of their ability. So that's it for that. Thank you guys for kind of being on for the talk and seeing kind of how we're trying to use data we're collecting along with kind of the HPCC system platform from LexisNexis, just to try and drive our process of training athletes with kind of data we're collecting and trying to better understand what we're doing with the athletes. So I'm trying to see the questions here, but the window is kind of small. I can't kind of read the question. There's some way to kind of increase the size of the question box. Oh, never mind, I got it. Okay. So someone had asked, is the HPCC Systems machine learning libraries open source? Yes, the entire platform is open source. You can download it from their website and be able to download all the different bundles of things that they have to offer. And they have a huge community that works on kind of developing all different parts of their platform. So you can go on there and download that and start to kind of learn how to use their system. But it's been great working with them because they've been able to provide us with all these tools and resources to be able to try and work on all these different things that we're trying to develop for ourselves. Someone had asked, how many sports teams are we currently working with or trying to use this approach with to see what we can kind of look ahead in the future with our data. So right now we've kind of been focused on men's soccer in terms of trying to apply kind of the process that was talked about here. The goal is to next move into something like women's basketball or possibly men's basketball. We were doing it for a bit with women's soccer, but they actually currently are not using GPS software, so we can't do the same amount that we've been doing with the men's soccer. And so far, that's kind of how we've spent our time and effort. So right now, those kind of men's soccer and the two basketball teams are the main ones that are using GPS. So that's kind of where we want to try and apply this process. But with the other teams, we're going to kind of work on how we want to apply the same ideas across them, and then how, what different data sources we can use to try and still achieve as much of that as we possibly can. So someone had asked how we chose the DB scan over other clustering algorithms. So we had decided to go with that just because for our data, it does seem to be very noisy, and the DB scan was designed to be able to work with data that is very noisy and try and make as much sense of it as possible. We had also tried to originally build it with more of like a k-means approach, but we had decided to then go more with the DB scan approach just because of what our data looked like specifically. So there's other ways that we could have done it, but for our specific case and our GPS data, we decided that was going to be kind of the best approach. So then someone had asked, how might you design a practice that is in the rain or a shortened practice? What would the process be to pick those drills, still maintaining a high quality for this practice? So that's a great question. I mean, obviously, There's been days where it's been really crazy weather and it may affect what we're able to do that day, because obviously if the rain is bad enough and the field conditions aren't great, it's going to be risky to be out there and doing the practice with the athletes, and we obviously don't want to put them at any unnecessary risk for injury or straining or hurting anything. Um, so, one approach from there may be to then say, all right, well, if we can't be out there for as long, we want to make sure that we can get some sort of intensity in. So we may pick some drills that will be a little more kind of high intensity based on how high their heart rate is getting, and how high it may stay for the duration of that drill. How many high intensity type efforts or impacts we can get in a small window of time without obviously doing anything that would be risky, because obviously it's going to be hard to sprint when the ground conditions aren't great. But obviously trying to find the drills that will make the most sense with having the intensity be high, so that if the volume has to be lower, we can still get a lot out of that practice. So someone had asked, is the GPS data just for how much distance is traveled by the player, or is there also analysis for where the player is on the field? There is an ability to use our data to look at where they are on the field, or kind of how they're moving, tracking their paths and their tendencies. We haven't done a huge amount of that quite yet. We had decided to go more the direction that we had so far, with looking at kind of periods of average heart rate and different periods of the games, because that was something that we hadn't really seen done yet and wasn't able to be done in different GPS software packages already. There is the ability, like in our StatSport software, to look at some of the pathing of players and tracking that sort of stuff, or like designing a heat map on the field. So we wanted to work on stuff that was a little bit less available already, and would be a little bit kind of stuff that we couldn't do elsewhere to this point. But there is the ability to do that sort of thing using our data. Do we plan on leveraging this model for any of the other sports? Ideally, yes. We would like to work on as many other sports as possible, but right now, not all of our sports have the same type of data sources coming in. So first, we would have to figure out what would be the best way to try and apply this sort of approach to those sports. Again, trying to use the data sources available. And if we could eventually apply something similar to a GPS, or some sort of kind of way to measure that on the field load, then we'll start to try and apply these approaches as best as possible. Are there any metrics to track to compare performance? Anything you can point to say there is not a benefit to this type of analysis? So one thing, like I was kind of getting into with the learning tree, was, again, there isn't a super high accuracy so far with how our ability is to try and predict some of our subjective outcomes based on the objective data. So it's something we're still tweaking to try and see if we can improve the model with how we're trying to run it. But again, a lot of our data, again, is just there to try and help us gain more information, to create conversation with coaches and try and improve the process with how we're getting to decisions, and not try and actually use the data to make the decisions, because it's never going to be an exact science, and it's never going to be kind of give us exact relationships that we're looking for. So, if we can't find things that may give us enough of a connection, or a good enough relationship, or good enough information, then we have to figure out where our time and effort is going to be better spent. So, we'll get endless amounts of different variables from our GPS data, but again, we're trying to focus on the ones that we put into the model, because the other ones aren't giving us the same amount of return on investment. So similar to our other pieces of equipment, if we are using our other stuff in the gym, what GPS, or other than GPS, like the NORD board, or the gym aware, what information is giving us good relationships to be able to understand what's happening in the gym, off the field, so that we can actually know, all right, this data is giving us some sort of trend. When we track like the NORD board data to understand their hamstring strength over time, I think that's been giving us good information, but not as much from like the force plates on their jump stuff. So I've
Sorry to
spent
interrupt
more time.
you, Christopher. We are already running out of time. Thank you for speaking, Christopher. We are grateful to those who have attended the session and will now provide our survey at the end. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to finish saying, with the NordBoard data, we've seen a lot of return on investment, so we're spending a lot more time collecting that. And a lot of it, again, is just going to be more physical characteristics that may lead to an increase in performance. So trying to find what we can best spend our time and effort on so we can get as much return from our time and effort based on how we're then using that data.